Hi guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, leave me a comment down below letting me know what you want to see next. Hit the like button, the notification bell button, and definitely make sure to subscribe, guys. It would mean so much to me. Today's case was requested by Emma, so thanks so much for this case suggestion. Now, back in the day, I remember hearing Emmett Till's name in a few rap songs, hip hop songs, and I never really knew who that name was, so I looked it up, and then the case was too upsetting for me, so I never looked further into it. But when Emma requested it, I was like, okay, I have to do this case. If I didn't know who he was, I feel like a lot of people my age may not know, or people younger. So I thought it's important. Let's just talk about this case and what happened to Emmett Till. So let's begin by talking about his mom, Mamie Carthen. And not only do I find her so fascinating, but also because she is quite an important part in his story. So Mamie was born on 23rd November 1921 in Mississippi. And in 1924, when she turned 2, she moved with her mother, Alma, and her brother, John, to a town called Argo in Illinois. And they moved here because her father, John Sr., he had secured a job working at the Argo Corn Products Refining Company. And he wanted to leave the South. He wanted to leave the cotton fields. And the birth of his daughter, Mamie, encouraged him and inspired him to make a better life for themselves. Mamie and her family then settled in Argo, and they lived in a predominantly black area where everyone just knew each other. But at the age of 13, her life was shattered when her parents got a divorce. And Mamie was a smart girl and a really good student, so she just buried herself in her studies, and that's how she got through it. Now, Mamie's parents were strict and religious, and girls back then, they rarely finished school. Their main ambition was to get married. That was the biggest and kind of only goal for girls back then. But Mamie's parents, they encouraged her to finish, and I believe she was the first Black student to become part of the honor roll, as well as being the 4th Black student to actually graduate from Argo High School. And every year, Mamie would return to Mississippi to visit relatives that she had over there. She would spend most of her summers in Mississippi with her aunt, and she would love going over there and socializing with the other kids at church picnics. When Mamie turned 18, she met a man from Madrid, Missouri, called Lewis Till. He worked at the Argo Corn Company, and he was an amateur boxer, and he was popular with many women. But Lewis, he only had eyes for Mamie. When they first met, he took her to an ice cream parlor so they could share a banana split. And her parents actually disapproved of him because they thought that Lewis was too sophisticated for their daughter. And her mom just kept kind of insisting that he was just not the right person for her. So Mamie actually broke it off with Lewis, and she listened to her mom. But Lewis, he was pretty insistent and persistent. So because of that, he won Mamie's heart, and they ended up getting married on October 14th, 1940. And I read that they were actually both 18 years old. So they got married very quickly. Like, isn't it wild how quickly back in the day people get married or got married? It's just so quick. 9 months later, on 25th July 1941, nearly exactly 9 months later, Mamie gives birth to their first and only child, Emmett Lewis Till. Emmett was nicknamed Bobo, and he was born at the County Cook Hospital in Chicago. Now, as soon as Emmett was born, he was the apple of not only his mom's eye, but his grandmother's. And he caught polio when he was 5 years old, and that left him with a mild stutter. But apart from that, Emmett was a very happy, young, healthy boy. So in or around 1942, so very quick into their marriage, Mamie finds out that Lewis had been unfaithful, and along with that, he was also allegedly abusive in their marriage. He was physically abusive, and Lewis turned out to be quite a violent man. So when Emmett was just a few months old, Mamie files this court order against Lewis. When Lewis found out, he responded by choking her till she was unconscious, and Mamie, fighting back, she threw boiling water at him. Then when the authorities got involved, Lewis got in trouble for violating court orders. So the judge made him choose go to jail or go to the army. Lewis chose the army. So when Emmett was really young, his father, Lewis, gets shipped out to the army. And then 3 years later, in July 1945, Mamie gets a letter in the mail from the Department of Defense claiming that Lewis Till had died. The letter didn't give much explanation, just stated that he was killed in Italy due to willful misconduct, and she wasn't given a full report of her husband's death. So Mamie receives a few of Lewis's possessions back from the army, and one of them was this ring that was engraved with LT on it. And then later on, she finds out that Lewis was executed for rape and murder. After that, she almost never spoke of Lewis. Maybe she was just traumatized that he could have done that. And she saved the ring, though, for Emmett because she believed that he may have wanted it when he got older. By the early 1950s, Mamie and Emmett had moved to the south side of Chicago. Both of Mamie's parents had remarried at this point, and her mother had moved to Chicago, but her father moved to Detroit. And soon after, Mamie met a man named Gene Pink Bradley, and the two of them got married, but they got divorced shortly after, just 2 years later. By 1954, Emmett was growing into a really responsible and happy teenager, and Mamie worked long hours working as a secretary. So Emmett would actually cook and clean for his family. That Christmas, Mamie bought Emmett a new suit, and the two of them, they posed for a Christmas picture together. Then in August 1955, Mamie wanted to take this long-awaited vacation to Nebraska to visit her relatives, and she wanted Emmett to come along with her. But Emmett, he was set on going to Money, Mississippi, because he wanted to spend time with his cousins. Now, Emmett wanted to spend the whole summer there, and Mamie was apprehensive. She felt like Emmett was dangerously ignorant to the risks of life and safety for Black Americans in the Deep South. And even though she felt this way, she still decided to let him go. But before she actually let him go, she was like pounding into him, how dangerous it was in Mississippi. And she just kept telling him about it. Now, even though racism existed everywhere, the rules were stricter for Black people in the South. Mamie told Emmett, avoid white people at all costs. If you have to get down on your knees and bow down to a white person as they walk past, you do so. Emmett was 14, and he said he understood, and he packed his ring that his late father had left him, and he wanted to bring it with him to show it to his cousins. At the train station, they hugged for such a long time, and they hugged for so long that he nearly missed his train. When Mamie put her son on a southbound train, it was the last time she would see him alive. Now, just to give an idea of what was going on at the time, I've looked up a couple of facts and just to see and show you guys what life was like back then. So on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court orders public schools be desegregated in Brown versus Board of Education. On May 7th, 1955, Reverend George Lee, who was a grocery store owner and NAACP field worker in Mississippi, is shot and killed at point-blank range while driving his car after trying to go and vote. A few weeks later, in Brookhaven, Mississippi, Lamar Smith, another Black man, is shot and killed in front of the county courthouse in broad daylight and before multiple witnesses after he went and casted his vote. Both victims had been active in voter registration drives, and no one would be arrested or charged in connection with either of those murders. And I do want to stick to Emmett's case, but I just thought it's important to give a little background of what times were like back then. So the last time Mamie had seen Emmett was when she put him on that southbound train, and he was to spend the summer with his cousins in Mississippi. A week later, Mamie's phone rings in the middle of the night, and it's her cousin, and she's told that white men had kidnapped Emmett in the middle of the night. I mean, Mamie already having that fear and then being called and told exactly what your worst fear is, I couldn't even imagine. Emmett's cousin, 16-year-old Wheeler Parker Jr., had traveled to Mississippi with him. He stated that Emmett, he loved pranks, he loved jokes, he loved clowning on people, and he was just there in the center of everything. He was a natural born leader. Emmett, he was just really unprepared for the rigidly maintained racial order down in the Deep South, where blacks had to show constant respect to the whites or they would face violent punishment. Emmett was there for a 2-week stay where he was supposed to just experience the life in Mississippi with all his cousins. And for the first 3 days, he really did so. They shut off fireworks, they swam in a snake-infested pool, and they stole watermelons. For Emmett, the trouble started on 24th August 1955 when he went to visit Bryan's Meat Market, which was a grocery store in Money, Mississippi. That evening, Emmett and his cousins, 7 boys and 1 girl, they drove in their car for a few miles to go to this grocery store, and this grocery store was owned by a white couple. The couple that owned the store, the man's name was Roy Bryant, and his 21-year-old wife, Carol Bryant, was at the store at the time Emmett and his cousins came to visit. So that afternoon, Emmett and his cousins came to the store to buy some candy. Now, the store owned by Roy and Carolyn, they primarily sold supplies and candy to a black clientele of sharecroppers and their children. So it wasn't anything unusual for Emmett and his cousins to come into the store. Now, when they got to the store, they kind of hung around at the front of the store for a few minutes, and then Emmett and his cousin, they went into the store to buy the candy. Now, there's many different accounts of what actually happened, but most places I read, it stated that as Emmett was leaving the store, he whistles at Carolyn, and then Carolyn goes to get a gun. Now, this whistle supposedly happened when his cousin walked out of the store and Emmett was left in the store with Carolyn for a minute or so. Now, whatever actually happened is not known, but whatever did happen doomed Emmett and his entire life. Now, according to Carolyn, what allegedly happened was Emmett asked for some candy that was inside a counter. So Carolyn went and grabbed it, and then she came back and she placed the candy on top of the counter. When she did so, Emmett allegedly placed his hand on top of her hand and said, "How about a date, baby?" When Carolyn grabbed her hand away from Emmett and pulled it free, apparently he grabbed her around the waist and pulled her close and said, "You shouldn't be afraid of me, baby. I've slept with plenty of white women." Now, Emmett's cousin, Simeon, or correct me if I'm wrong, Simon Simeon, right, later questioned Carolyn's account, stating that you were in the store with him for less than a minute and I never heard any of this conversation. So it's hard for him to believe that this took place. His cousin states that Emmett paid for his items and then they left the store together. Now, this is a bit of a spoiler, but I feel it's important to share now just so we don't place any judgment on this young boy. So more than 50 years later, when Carolyn was interviewed again, she has admitted that she lied about this encounter and made it up. Now, what happened after the store, there is general agreement about that, and it goes as follows. So as Carolyn left the store and she was walking to her car, allegedly to retrieve a gun, Emmett whistled. His cousins described it as a big city wolf whistle. As soon as he did this, his cousins immediately knew that Emmett just broke this unspoken code of how you behave around white people. And they knew that they were all now in grave danger. Which, man, when we complain about our lives now, I always try and think about what it was like back then for people. And can you imagine, like, the way we act now as a society is just no one cares about anything, right? But can you imagine if whistling was going to get you in trouble? Like, you know what I mean? It's wild what it was like back then. Now, after Emmett allegedly whistled, his cousins and everyone, they got back in the car and they sped out of there. But what I don't really understand is, why was Carolyn already on her way to get a gun if they were already on their way out of the store? You know, and she predominantly sold to Black families and kids. I just don't understand that part. So something kind of went on there. Now, it's alleged that Emmett didn't whistle at anyone in particular. He just whistled. Like, maybe he was just excited. He just whistled for fun. Whistled. But then there were other sources that I read stating that Emmett actually whistled at Caroline. So I don't know which one's true. Now, his cousins believe that Emmett just kind of whistled to make them laugh, but they were so shocked from this encounter because they knew how to behave, you know, in that town. Also, I just feel like Carolyn was afraid. I just felt like Carolyn was uncomfortable with having them in her store. And it's so annoying because it's like, you predominantly sold to this clientele. What were you so afraid of? You know, what were they going to do? But that's just the way it was back then. So after this took place, the town was just talking about this incident. Everyone was talking about what happened at the Bryant's store. Then on Friday, August 26th, Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, he returns back from a job where he was hauling shrimp. That afternoon at his store, a young Black customer told Roy what all the talk of the town was, what happened at his store. And he even told him that the offending teenager was a young Black boy that was not from the town. Now, later on, years later, when Roy was interviewed, he told a reporter that if he had done nothing after this incident took place that involved his wife, he would have looked like a coward. So when Roy got home that evening, he goes up to Carolyn and he says, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" And when she denies wanting to tell him anything, that just made him more angry. So he goes, "You better tell me. I already know." And he tells her, "I want to hear your version of what happened at the store." So Carolyn then tells her husband, Roy, her version of events of what happened that day, and that Emmett, a 14-year-old boy, made sexual advances towards her. A few days later, on 27th August 1955, Roy, together with the help of his half-brother John W. Millam, they decided to kidnap 14-year-old Emmett in the middle of the night to teach him a lesson. Now, the two of these men, Roy and John, they were described as kind of just doing everything together. They worked together, they played together, they hung out all the time, and they were known to be particularly close. People who knew Roy and John kind of just described them as being multiple names, but essentially they were just calling them white trash. Which, if that's how people knew them, keep that in mind for when we go on to the rest of the story. So on the night of 27th August, Roy, John Millam, Carolyn, and another man named Johnny, who was actually a Black man, who just did odd jobs here and there for the men, they set off in John's pickup truck to look for the boy. So on the way, as they were driving around, they spot this young Black boy. He's walking home and he's holding a jar of molasses and snuff. And Roy orders Johnny, the black man who was the helper, to throw this boy in the back of the pickup truck. So Johnny did so, and then Carolyn, she emerges from the truck. Okay, and I really don't mean to offend anyone, but this is what the dialogue apparently went like. Carolyn emerges from the truck and she says, "That's not the N-word. That's not the boy that did that." So then Roy tells Johnny, okay, throw this boy out. He's not the right boy. So Johnny does so, and this boy hits the ground like on his face, and he loses his two front teeth. Now, Emmett was visiting and staying with his cousins, right? So he was staying with his uncle, Moses Wright. So within the next few hours, the men, Roy and John, they learn that Emmett is staying at his uncle Moses Wright's house. So they make their way there. So at 2:30 a.m., they pull up to Moses Wright's house, and Emmett and his cousins had actually spent the night before drinking and looking for girls around the area, but by this time they were already asleep. So Roy goes to the front of the house and he calls out, "Preacher, preacher." So then Moses hears this, and then he goes to the front door and he sees Roy, and Roy tells him he's looking for that fat boy from Chicago. So as Moses looks on and tries to figure out who these men are, he sees Roy, and then he also sees John, but then he sees another black man, but this black man's hiding his face. This black man turned out to be Other Johnson, who was actually John's helper. And I believe he himself came forward later because no one actually knew who he was until he kind of like turned himself in. So the men then walked around searching the bedrooms for Emmett. So then when they get to the bed that Emmett is sleeping in, John approaches this bed with a flashlight and he shines the flashlight in Emmett's face and he says, "Are you the N-word that was talking down at Money?" And then Emmett like wakes up and he goes, "Yeah." And then John says, "Don't say yeah to me, N-word, I'll blow your head off." They then tell Emmett to put his clothes on. And as Emmett's cousin would later recount, Moses Wright, his uncle, begged for the men not to take Emmett. And Moses's wife, Emmett's auntie, even offered the men money to leave Emmett alone. Now, Roy apparently actually hesitated, but John Malam, he was just hell-bent on continuing on with this abduction, and he tells the Wrights, "If you even utter a word of this to anyone, I'll come back and kill your family." So then they take Emmett out of the house and they load him up into the pickup truck. I mean, I'm sure he knew what was about to happen, but how traumatized he would have been, I don't even know. That's his sister's son, you know, like. Now, as he's standing on the porch looking out, he hears a voice, a woman's voice, possibly Carolyn's, most likely Carolyn's, and he hears her tell the men that they found the right boy. Now, what happened over the next 3 to 4 hours is not known for certain, but it is agreed that these men, they brought Emmett over to Caroline to confirm his identity before what happens. And Carolyn actually writes in this memoir that when the men brought Emmett to her, she told them that that was not the boy, and that was not the boy that did that to her. But it seems to obviously be a lie, and it's just trying to like save her own ass, because the events that follow next do not correlate with her version of events. So first, it is believed that these assholes, Roy and John, they drove Emmett like 75 miles looking for this cliff that had 100-foot drop into the Mississippi River, but they couldn't find it. So they drove back to Drew, Mississippi, and they drove to this barn on a farm that was owned by Leslie Milan, which was John's brother. A man named Willie Reed, he accounts that at 6 a.m. he saw a white and green Chevrolet truck with 4 white men riding inside and 3 black men standing in the back, and another black boy, Emmett, seated in the back of the truck. He claimed that he saw the truck park outside this barn of Leslie Malam, and then he heard hollering and what sounded like whipping. I mean, honestly, what follows next is very, very, very upsetting. So if you guys don't know the story of Emmett Till, I'm just warning you now, it's bad. This 14-year-old boy was beaten severely. One of his eyes was gouged out, and then they shot and killed Emmett Till. The men later on claimed that even during his beating, Emmett was extremely defiant, was claiming that he wasn't scared of these men and that he had had white women. So after this pickup truck, it leaves Leslie's farm, drives on over to a store in Glendora, stops briefly there. This store was owned by John Malam. And I'm guessing this was really early in the morning because they abducted him at 2:30 in the morning. So I'm guessing this would have been, earlier that next morning. There, when they stopped outside John's store, a witness over there claimed that he saw blood dripping out of the truck and pooling onto the floor. So he tells John, like, hey, look, there's blood in your truck. John allegedly told him, well, that's deer blood. I killed a deer. And then this witness says to John, well, it's not deer season. And upon saying this, John reaches over, grabs the tarp that was covering something in the back of the pickup truck, and he pulls it back and he exposes Emmett's dead body. He then tells this witness, this is what happens to smart N-words. And then all four men get back in the truck and then they drive away. The men then tied Emmett's body with barbed wire to this large industrial fan, and then they dumped him in the Mississippi River. The men then tie Emmett's body with barbed wire to this large industrial fan, and then they dump him in the nearby Tallahassee River. So now back to when Mamie received that call about Emmett and him being kidnapped, and her and her family, they did everything they could to find Emmett. On Wednesday, August 31st, 1955, another call was received by Mamie. Emmett's body had been found in the river. A boy named Robert Hodges, who was fishing in the river, saw a pair of feet sticking out of the water. The badly beaten and bloated body of Emmett Till was pulled out of the water and put onto a boat. He had been shot and beaten beyond recognition. His body managed to be weighed down by that large industrial fan and the barbed wire that was holding him stuck to it. Uncle Moses was called to identify the body, and his body was so badly beaten, so badly disfigured, but Uncle Moses was able to identify him through his father's ring. Now, you wouldn't even try and understand how Mamie dealt with this, how she dealt with the loss, not only the loss of her only son, but the way he was killed and for what. But she makes a statement saying, when I began to make the announcement that Emmett had been found and how he was found, the whole house began to scream and cry. And that's when I realized that this was a load that I was going to have to carry. I wouldn't get any help carrying this load. Now, the local authorities and the sheriff, being a plantation owner, wanted to quickly bury Emmett's body and just get it over and done with and not make a big circus out of it. They were hoping that no one in the outside world would ever find out what happened to Emmett Till. But Mamie obviously didn't want that, so she called a black funeral home in Chicago to help her. After negotiations that involved a Chicago congressman, they made plans to bring Emmett's body back home to Chicago. Now, in one of the most famous parts of this case, at the funeral home, Mamie did not want Emmett's body and face to be covered. She wanted everyone to see what had been done to her son. Despite everyone's warnings, Mamie still wanted to see her son. She wanted to see what he looked like, and she wanted to identify him, that it really was him. The funeral director really hesitated and didn't want to let her, but Mamie was insistent. She stated, "I looked at his teeth because I took so much pride in his teeth. His teeth were the prettiest things I'd seen in my life, I thought. And I only saw 2. Where were the rest of them? They'd just been knocked out." And she's referring to his teeth, the fact that there was only 2 teeth left. Teeth? He had adult teeth at this point. He didn't have baby teeth. So the fact that there's 2 teeth left lets you know how badly he was beaten. Now, the Mississippi authorities agreed to send through Emmett's body back to Chicago only if the casket stayed sealed. And this just makes you question, well, why? Why do you need it to stay sealed? But Mamie did not care. As she looked at her son, she had just one thought. She said, "Let the people see what they did to my boy." So for Emmett's funeral, she had an open casket viewing. She was determined that this type of crime would not happen again, and she wanted everyone to see what had happened to Emmett Till. She believed everyone should know what happened to him. She stated, "Because when people saw what had happened to this little 14-year-old boy, they knew then that not only were black men in danger, but black children as well. I want the world to see this." Mamie also granted a photographer from a black magazine, Jet, to take photos of Emmett at his funeral and publish them. Now, although every single major newspaper in the country covered Emmett's funeral, only a few black magazines, including Jet, actually published the pictures, the gruesome pictures, and many black Americans came to know those images very well, but majority of white Americans did not. Now, I've mentioned before how fast things moved back in the day. So the day that Emmett's body was buried was the same day that Roy and John were arrested and indicted on charges of kidnapping and murder. Their trial was held in the small Mississippi town of Sumner, and it started on the 19th of September, 1955. The star witness was Emmett's uncle, Moses Wright, who bravely stood up in the courtroom and just pointed his finger at the 2 men who kidnapped his nephew Emmett, and he pointed directly at Roy and John. Another key witness was that 18-year-old sharecropper Willie Reed, who had seen the men drive into Leslie's barn, and he heard the screams of Emmett as they were beating him. Now, after testifying against Roy and John, Willie Reed, he feared for his life, and he was smuggled out of Mississippi. He was sent to Chicago, and when he arrived in Chicago, he suffered a nervous breakdown and he was hospitalized. He was only 18. He must have been terrified. Now, during the trial, that same sheriff, the one who was the plantation owner and who tried to cover everything up, stated that the body that they found in the water, could not have been Emmett Till because the body looked more like a grown man. Also, the body was likely in the water for 4 to 5 days. And that again proves that it wasn't Emmett, because Emmett had only been abducted 3 days prior to when the body was found. He claimed, Emmett's probably still somewhere around in the area. And this looked great for Roy and John because now they had the support of the sheriff. Now, Mississippi residents were actually shocked at this crime, and the governor urged for prosecution of this case to take place. The DA stated, "Murder is murder, whether it is black or white, and we are handling this case like all parties are white." I know that statement is supposed to be good, but the fact that statements like that were even made, like, we're going to treat this case like if it was all parties were white, so that means that everyone's going to have a fair trial. Like, what? Then everything changed because the executive secretary of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, described Emmett's killing as a lynching and stated that the state of Mississippi has decided to maintain white supremacy by murdering children. And many Mississippians were deeply angered by this, and many agreed. But then some people claim that because of this statement that was made, it forced people to dig their heels in even more and support Roy and John, even the same people that actually wanted them to pay for this crime. Also, in 1955, none of the Black residents in that county where the trial was taking place, at Tallahatchie County, were registered voters. What does that mean? That no one on the jury was Black. None. No Black person was eligible to serve on the jury. So the jury consisted of 12 white men. One of the defense attorneys later on made a statement saying any first-year law student could have won this case. So remember this, the sheriff made that statement that the body found in the water could not have been Emmett. So multiple people were called to the stand to disprove his statement. And one of them was Mamie, who made a statement saying, I positively identified the body in the casket and later on when it was on the slab as being that of my son, Emmett Lewis Till. It's like you can't tell a mom that that's not their kid, right? Like she would know if it's her child or not. Like she can tell by a simple, even by his teeth. She could probably tell the 2 teeth that were left in that poor child's mouth. She probably could have identified him just from those 2 teeth. Then Carolyn Bryant, she takes the stand and she testifies that Emmett had flirted with her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her in and just made advances towards her. She claims that his actions of this 14-year-old boy made her extremely scared for her life, but the judge ruled her testimony as inadmissible because she had told this story to so many people in the town following his death. So afterwards, there was a brief testimony of 5 character witnesses for John and Roy. Once that was done, closing arguments began. And District Attorney Chatham, he gave this speech in his closing argument that moved many, and he demanded justice for the murder of Emmett. And he stated, they murdered that boy. And to hide that dastardly, cowardly act, they tied barbed wire to his neck and to a heavy gin fan and dumped him into the river for the turtles and the fish. The 2 defendants were dripping with the blood of Emmett Till. But the defense, as if this case wasn't based on race enough, the defense attorneys say to the jurors, every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to set these men free. Jesus Christ. On 23rd September 1955, it took this 12-man white jury all but 1 hour and 7 minutes to come back with the verdict of not guilty for the 2 men. Are you surprised? And the audacity of people, because let me tell you, when I was pissed reading this case, I'm pissed again now because one juror said, it wouldn't have taken that long, but we stopped to have a soda pop break to make it look good because that's what the sheriff advised them to do. The sheriff told them, go have a soda break in between your deliberations and trying to figure out whether he's guilty or not so that it looks like you guys took a little bit longer. And it still only took them 1 hour and 7 minutes. John and Roy are congratulated by their many supporters. They're hugging their wives, kissing their wives, and there's photos of this. And Mamie, she didn't actually stay for the verdict of not guilty because I'm guessing she already knew. She knew they're not gonna be held responsible for killing my son. So after these 2 men were acquitted on murder charges, Mamie and all her supporters and Black leaders were hoping that these men would at least be convicted on kidnapping charges. But weeks before that trial, a Mississippi senator, he was a firm segregationist and a plantation owner, he dug up Emmett Till's father's past, Lewis Till's, that, when he was in the army, he was convicted of 2 Italian women and killing a 3rd. And the reason why he did this was to plant a seed stating that Emmett was just like his father. This behavior ran in the family. On November 9th, 1955, another Mississippi jury refused to indict John and Roy on these kidnapping charges, and the men were set free. Great times. 4 months after this trial, knowing that double jeopardy law protected these men from being tried for the same crimes, Roy and John admitted to a reporter from Look magazine that they in fact did beat and kill Emmett Till. and tortured him. They were paid $4,000 for this story. Mamie fought for justice, leaving her boy to be seen in an open casket, tortured. I mean, if you guys haven't seen the photos, I think I will post them here because she did want them to be shared. So if I haven't already shown it, I'll show it now. I mean, she wanted the world to see what they did to her son, and she succeeded in having a powerful effect. Black Americans nationwide and around the world were shocked by what happened to Emmett Till. Emmett's death occurred just 3 months before the Rosa Parks incident on the bus, and it is largely credited with catalyzing the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Long after Emmett's murder, Mamie continued to advocate for herself and other Black Americans. In 1957, she married a man named Till-Mobley, and she remained happily married with him until his death in the year 2000. In 1960, Mamie became a teacher and an activist for racial equality. She routinely delivered speeches nationwide, which significantly helped the NAACP in their fundraising and growth efforts. She also got a master's degree in administration from Loyola University, Chicago in 1976. So, I mean, she really didn't sit down after what happened to Emmett. She fought. Most people can fall into a big downward spiral, and she didn't. She fought for Emmett. And before we let this fly over our heads, let's think about the fact that Emmett's family has had to live with the fact that his killers confessed and nothing ever happened to them. They've had to live with this for nearly 50 years. Mamie died of heart failure in a Chicago hospital in the year 2003. She was 81, and she is buried next to Emmett Till in Burr Oak Cemetery. And on her monument are printed these words: "Her pain united a nation." Oh my gosh, just gave me shivers. John Malam died of cancer of the bone in the year 1980, and Roy died of cancer in the year 1994. Crazy how they both died of cancer, but at the same time, maybe that's common because maybe they smoked or something. I don't know. Now, in a 2008 interview, Carolyn Bryant actually did an interview with a historian, and during that interview, she did admit that what she said about Emmett at the trial wasn't true, and I mentioned that earlier, but she stated that she had gotten the story based off a Southern racist horror movie called The Black Beast. She goes on to say, "Nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him." Which, if she made this statement, she's acting like she wasn't the one that caused this whole incident. But her family has denied that she ever made that statement or confessed to lying about Emmett and what happened that day. And recently, I think it just came out like a couple days ago, Carolyn died at the age of 88. Now, she lived a whole ass life, and I don't really want to get into that because I don't think we need to talk about how she ended up living a decent life, because she died at 88. So whatever. No one was ever convicted for the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Emmett Till. No one. I mean, this whole case is wild, and there's a reason why I never ever wanted to read about it, because it is so upsetting. It is angering, and if you see the photos, it even makes you even more angry that that's a 14-year-old boy. When I first saw that, I really thought it was a grown man, because I just couldn't imagine someone doing that to a young child. I can't imagine what his last moments were like and how scared he must have been. He wasn't even anywhere near his mom, and how terrifying it must have been for him. But unfortunately, we still see this type of behavior in today's society years and years later. Do you remember during COVID in the year 2020, there was a woman named Amy, and I think back then, remember when the restrictions were really strict, there was a woman named Amy, and she was accusing this black man of threatening her. This clip went viral. She was pretending to be hysterical and afraid of this black man. His name was Christian, because he told her to put her dog on a leash. And she was like, "Oh my God, I'm so afraid of this black man." And she calls the police. Do you remember that, guys? She was wild. Luckily, this guy, Christian, he had his phone on him, and he was able to record the whole incident because it was so disturbing. And that's a mild form of racism that exists. still blows my mind. Blows my mind that our world is the way it is. And honestly, I feel like it's getting worse. It's going back in a different direction, but technology and everything just makes it that much worse, I think. Even though some racist acts are caught on camera nowadays, a lot of them go unchallenged, like the case of Emmett Till. And Emmett really paid the ultimate price. This case really speaks to history. It really shows what Black people had to go through back in those times. What do you guys think? I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this case before. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Rest in peace to Emmett, his mom, and his whole family that has to live with what happened to this beautiful boy. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.